I think, an amazing sort of front that's very exciting. And there's, in Texas public policy, in our transportation system, I think a lot of us feel like things don't change, and a lot of us feel like it just seems like it's insurmountable. But I think one place where we really are seeing really positive, smart change is at the city level, and cities changing their design manuals and changing the codes and the rules for how our streets work, and who they work for, and what kind of things, what we are designing them for you to be able to do on those streets. And I think there's really great work happening across the state. So we wanted to have a forum to bring together some people from cities across the state who are doing this kind of work. And this isn't the exhaustive list. There's other good work happening in other cities too. So our speakers for today, I'll go ahead and introduce all of them, and then I'll introduce each of them to kind of lead us through. I guess as each person presents, we'll pause at the end to kind of discuss their slides and have any questions. But then at the end, I think it's just be really neat to have this as a statewide conversation at the end, and where we think all this is really going. And also, if anybody with any cities that want to, how do we all steal good ideas? And I strongly encourage the stealing of ideas that you see presented today, because I think there's going to be a lot of good ones. So we are going to hear from two people from the City of Austin Transportation Department, and that's Mike Schofield, who hopefully is getting on here. Oh, there you are. So Mike will present first from the point of view of sort of multimodal safety in the streets, and how is the City of Austin Transportation Criteria Manual going to change the future for the streets of Austin. And then Dan Hennessy was going to talk about how the Transportation Criteria Manual will change development, and how we ask developers to also contribute to making streets safe and things like that. And just so everybody knows, and we'll put a link in the chat later, but that is out for public comment right now, and the public comment period ends November 1st or 2nd. And then the Austin Transportation Department and City Manager will potentially decide on a final Transportation Criteria Manual for Austin this winter, and the changes will go in place. Then we're going to jump over to El Paso, and we have Joaquin Rodriguez from the City of El Paso City Design Lab to explain generally what they've been working on, and how they're integrating things like the NACO urban bikeway design into the City of El Paso's code. And then we will move all the way back over to the other side of the state, to Houston, and have two more people from Houston, and that's Ian Klavacek in the Houston Public Works, to talk about how the City of Houston has changed its infrastructure design manual. But then talk to David Fields, who's in the City of Houston Planning and Development Department, to talk about how they've been doing things similar to what Austin's doing to change the way developers are part of building a walkable city. And so with all of that, I'm very excited to have you all here. I think each presenter could declare it differently, but I think it would be best to let them go through their whole presentation, and then we'll have questions on each presentation. So if that sounds good, I will hand it to you, Mike, if you're ready to go.
Sure. Yeah, let me share a screen real quick.
I think you should be able to do it. Does it say? Is it letting you, or is it not letting you? Yeah, there.
I think it's letting me.
All right.
Oops, let me switch sides. Does that look full screen?
Looks great.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late. My name is Mike Schofield. I'm with the Austin Transportation Department in our active transportation and street design division. Here to talk to you about the ongoing update to the Transportation Criteria Manual here in the city. This is a lot of words, but very briefly, what the TCM update is hoping to achieve is that previously we had a criteria manual that was very rooted in AASHTO guidance, older AASHTO guidance, as well as, some ITE guidance, but not really incorporating the more modern guidance from NACDO, specifically related to, more like complete streets, walkable, bikeable streets. And our manual was very, very out of date. Actually, it hadn't had a full update since it's either the 80s or 90s. So, and there are still adopted figures and criteria in that manual from that era of the 90s. So what we're wanting to change here is make the streets, prioritized for safety, particularly sustainable modes of peds and bikes, as well as accommodating things like transit lanes that are not currently in our criteria. So where we're at right now, like Jay said, we're open for our final round of public comments currently. We've been through all of our, couple years of revisions, because this wasn't just a typical minor revision to a criteria manual. This was throw the whole thing out, start over again, work with all the departments on what will go in that document. So now we're in the final, let me minimize this, the final process of rules posting here, which is public comment until the 1st of November, and then it will be going for adoption. Like I said, the current criteria manual is very outdated. This is a figure that is still, current in the manual, shows, kind of what we don't want. It's just big multi-lane arterials. Typically we probably would not ever do a 4-lane undivided as a new street right now. Yet this is what our manual still shows. Doesn't really get into much detail about pedestrian or bike crossings or facilities. So very outdated, to the point that, we basically don't use it currently, because it's just so very out of date. Some background that might be helpful as I go through this is that in our Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, we have what are known as street levels, where anything that's not really highlighted in here, just like a little neighborhood street, that's a level 1 street. Collectors are 2s. And then if you're familiar with Austin, things like Pleasant Valley Road or Airport would be a 3. And something bigger like a major arterial or highway is like 4 or 5. So that's just for context as I am showing some of these figures. So again, very outdated previous TCM, where these are kind of similar levels of street and similar amounts of right of way. Previously, just a wide outside lane without designated bike lanes of any kind is what is shown in the currently adopted figures. Now we're showing, what we now know to be a much better, safer solution in our cross sections, with raised protected bike lanes, generally median divided for more major roadways. Kind of just a better multimodal experience. This is a lot of information, and I'll go to the next slide quickly, but this is probably the table that a designer of a street in Austin would be going to the most, which is really setting like what are the minimum and recommended dimensions of things like these raised bicycle lanes, the offset from the street, how wide the travel lanes need to be, the tree zones. This has all been updated and really modernized to prioritize multimodal safety. And a lot of what is informing this rewrite, especially in terms of how you would treat a level 1, like kind of just a calm neighborhood street, versus levels 2 and up, anything other than that, is the NACDO contextual guidance for high comfort bicycle facilities. So we refer to that a lot. And specifically, we refer to their guidance on, this is essentially what we would call a level 1 street. And so only in rare cases does the NACTO contextual guidance say that the right solution for the street is a shared street or bicycle boulevard, meaning, cyclists, even young cyclists who might be heading to school would just share the road, and they have very strict guidelines on that of, less than 20 miles an hour, maximum volume thresholds for vehicles. And that is kind of hard to overstate what a sea change that is in terms of thinking of designing our public streets. For any of y'all from Austin who might know how our old speed management applications worked, really when we thought about speed management previously, or even, up to today, we were thinking about, the posted speed of a neighborhood street is going to be about 30, maybe it was designed for 35. So let's collect the speed data, and the 85th percentile shows people are going 35. So maybe let's put a few speed humps in to slow them to a bit closer to the speed limit. But what we know from using this guidance is that it's not slow enough. We need to be aiming lower to make these level 1 streets actually safe for the neighborhoods. And really what this contextual guidance says is that everything else, anything of a higher volume or speed threshold, the right answer for that street is a protected bike lane. So that's kind of where that was our starting point for the TCM. The criteria now also looks at target speeds versus a more kind of a more typical design speed where you're going a bit above the speed limit. This is more like designing for where you want the speeds to be. So you'll see for these level 1s, a lot of that is going to be in the 20 mile an hour type of desired threshold. And, even at something like an airport boulevard, it is still going to be, the thought would be that it would be designed to be a bit slower than currently. And kind of that leads to the natural question of how do you design to get those speeds that are desired? This is a typical cross section for a level 1 street in our TCM update. Rather narrow street with parking both sides to create that friction. And now written into the criteria is that for new streets, there is a maximum spacing between a speed management treatment. And, that could be it could still be speed humps, but typically, that might also be things like pinch points or bulb outs or crossing islands that do more kind of horizontal deflection to slow speeds. And the idea here really is that rather than the previous way we did things was, a developer might build a whole network of streets for a development and they wouldn't put any speed management into it, and they're just long straight streets, and we know that will lead to speeding. We have the data that when those streets get built, there is a speeding problem right out of the gate. So rather than putting those new streets into our future work that we're going to need to handle with speed management down the road, this makes it much more proactive, and we're building in that speed management right from the start. So all of these things like bulb outs, crossing islands, raised crossings, we have been using them kind of as one-off designs for these kind of speed management projects, but now it's really built into our criteria manual as a tool that we can use by default without, lengthy approval and review from other departments. Same with our kind of neighborhood bikeway treatments that we might be using for, specific bike routes that we're retrofitting through town. We now have some tools such as, restricting vehicle crossings to kind of have lower volume neighborhood bikeways. That is now a tool in the toolbox that we did not previously have. Specifically to bulb outs, I know this is an important thing for some. The TCM is now very specific about it just says very straight, bulb outs are to be used as a preferred treatment rather than the inclusion of a turn lane at intersections. Of course, there's always going to be more major intersections where, maybe they're signalized, or for whatever reason, we know through analysis that a turn lane is needed there. But this kind of goes a long way to say that, by default, the solution is that if there's parking on the street, you'll bulb out at the intersection where that parking was. And, so things like reducing crossing distance with either median refuge areas or these bulb out solutions is now much more baked into our criteria. And here's just an example. This is an intersection in the Miller development here in Austin. Was essentially designed to the same criteria that we're talking about in the TCM update, but required, rigorous kind of going to different departments, getting design exceptions, going to the fire department, all kinds of groups, public works, to get permission to do this kind of more urban design to reduce crossing distances and reduce turning speed of vehicles. Now this is what the standard for, two neighborhood intersections and two neighborhood streets intersecting would be. It says specifically that it is a narrow width between the bulb outs and gives a much lower radius as standard for these intersections. And kind of move, that was all describing what our approach was on level 1 neighborhood streets. So this is kind of everything else falls into, we need the dedicated space for protected bike lanes in this bicycle street edge zone, as it's called in the TCM. And I'm sure most, if not all of you on the call are familiar with these approaches, but it's protected bikeway. Here it's shown as kind of an at street, but in general, the TCM is proposing raised bikeways as the main solution for new or retrofit streets, separating cyclists from the street zone. And now there is also now, for the first time, adopted guidance and figures for protected intersections, which is huge. This is really the preferred treatment for anywhere that we have separated bike lanes. As you approach an intersection, it gives the designer all the details they need to design it. Although we do have some upcoming standard details that would be an appendix to the TCM to give even, actual dimensions and a lot more detail about constructability. Not to say that protected intersections are something we haven't been doing. This, again, is in Miller, what I understand, one of the earlier protected intersections in the country. But again, took a lot of detailed conversations with different departments to make it happen. Whereas now it's just worded very deliberately, when non-vehicular modes of travel are separated prior to the intersection, protected intersections shall be the standard intersection design. So it doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room. It, unless there's a reason, that, we could give a waiver for, that would be the standard design for an intersection on anywhere that streets with bike lanes meet. Another big change for the TCM is that anywhere where, if you see like cut off here, what would be like the left to right street would be the major street in this example, and the up and down street would be the minor street, level 1. In those cases, the raised bikeway and the raised sidewalk would remain raised across the intersection. This is something we've seen examples of in other cities, notably in Cambridge. They were one of, if not the leader of raised bike lanes in the country. And, we heard from their experience that they did not require these raised crossings when they first started installing raised bikeways. And it was fairly problematic in terms of, feeling like you're riding and going up and down roller coaster as you hit these minor streets and driveways, as well as right hook problems from vehicles turning in, across the bike path quickly. Whereas this would slow anyone and kind of act as a gateway that you're entering, these lower speed streets. Oh, as well as we had a presentation on this last week, and there was a lot of questions about the treatment here. So as well as kind of visually indicating, this is all a big concrete apron. You would continue the colored bike lane across the intersection. So just visually, you can see that there is potential conflict here and to be aware. Similar to this, we have been building integral color into our bikeways in recent years, as well as standardizing the conflict markings of bikeways for a good number of years. But that it has not been an adopted criteria manual up until now. So this will kind of make that all very consistently done, whether it's an internal project to our department or a developer building or a big corridor project. So whoever's building this will all make it much more consistent. Regarding urban trails, this is also kind of bringing their criteria up to the state of practice that they're already following, but just getting it all written into the manual in terms of what is their desired width versus a minimum kind of 12-foot width of an urban trail. Things like slope grades, railing requirements, all of that stuff to properly design an urban trail, as well as design speeds that have never been really fully adopted until now. Now that is in the urban trail section, as well as the bikeway section, to make sure that we're not, creating, quick bends in bikeways, things that are just not comfortable or safe to navigate. As well as things like vertical clearance criteria. So kind of what has made these tighter, more human scale designs possible? We have been doing some of this stuff for a few years, but it has been a pretty cumbersome, process to get each unique design through all of the review process, because it's really not in an adopted criteria manual. So you see here, I'm showing turns of large vehicles. Really what this took to get this criteria all set was proving to all of the different stakeholders, interdepartmental stakeholders like emergency services, that this was going to work, and, people are pretty skeptical about change at first, of course. So, when it came to fire department and others, we, really had to prove out, yes, this is going to work. We'll show you all the turns run on all of the various levels of streets around all of the different corners of a neighborhood street or an arterial. And if you want us to go out with you in a fire truck to prove it even further and set up cones, we'll do that. And they took us up on that. So we went out for, an afternoon of riding around in fire trucks, of kind of really proving to all of the various stakeholders that this would work. So that really took rethinking of all different assumptions about roadway widths, about lane widths. These radii were a big deal to various stakeholders about, intersection radii, for example, if you were to look in our old criteria manual or in TxDOT's roadway design manual, for example, you're going to see radii that are, 50 plus feet often for certain levels of street. And we're showing, from the lower level streets, maybe 15 up to 25, 30 at the very highest. So it is pretty radically different, which took a lot of kind of talking people through and showing them that this could work, up to the point where we did need to amend fire code in the city to make this all mesh well together. So there was not a conflict between what is in our adopted criteria manual and the fire code, which resulted in this more human scale design. And it really took like rethinking our assumptions even more broadly about, what is the best, highest use of the street, and what does it really take to make a neighborhood street comfortable, for even a kid who might be biking in the middle of the street. And maybe that takes, more deliberate steps than what we've been doing in the past. So that was kind of the broad overview, but happy to take any questions. And before I do that, maybe I can put this in the chat, the link for the Speak Up Austin website. I think there's still about 2 weeks left to, week and a half, 2 weeks left to comment on the latest version.
Okay, great. That's all very exciting, Mike. Thank you. And I did actually put the chat just to the Speak Up Austin link in the chat, but didn't put the other, like the email address. Well, so I think that was all very exciting. I wonder if we have any questions before we move along. Please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and speak up. Let's see, somebody's got a hand up. So that's Adam Greenfield. Do you want to ask a question?
Hey, Mike. You mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned straight streets, because that I've long been a fan of slightly bent streets, or not having extremely long sections of straight streets. Not only because it encourages speeding, but for walking, it's just inherently dull. Mm-hmm. And while I think the more kind of old world organic street layout, where you have a street layout that's completely all over the map, like the ones I grew up in, are bad for navigation. It seems like some of the really nicest streets in Austin, like I'm thinking like Shoal Creek Boulevard, Alameda Drive, and Travis Heights, East Side Drive, I think, in Travis Heights. There's a loose grid, but they're also a little bit curvy. So there's something that unfolds as people progress. Does the TCM speak to that? Like, does it have things to say about really long straight streets and maybe not always doing that all the time?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge, I don't think that it, aside from the more typical way of thinking about it, which is like, what should your maximum or minimum curves be from like an engineering perspective? I don't, as well as, I guess a couple of things that would have changed in that regard would be, one is having the target speed, rather than kind of a typical design speed. So rather than like shooting for above what your posted speed is going to be, we would be aiming a little bit lower now. So again, that is still thinking of it a little bit backwards from what you're thinking. But in terms of trying to think of an example, I think you were in that conversation about Redbud, the bridge crossing, and there was going to be a very large sweeping curve added to that bridge. And, some of our local advocates asked some good questions about why would we not use a lower design speed that might have a lower resulting speed. And there were some modifications made to that. So certainly there's language in here that would now lead us to use lower speeds in general, as well as like this slide that I'm on, where there are maximum spacing between treatments on different levels of streets. And kind of the default treatments are horizontal deflection of various kinds, whether it's islands or bulb outs, or, you could imagine alternating islands and bulb outs would be kind of a chicane type of effect. But yeah, I don't believe that there's anything written in there specifically about kind of the overall curvature of the street versus a straight street. And I think that would be a great comment.
Well, I'll put that in, but I think the curb extensions and the pinch points, I'm especially excited to see pinch points in there. Yay for pinch points. I think that's all great stuff. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with yay for pinch points. We actually got a couple good notes from Gary Schatz, and maybe it's a little fun to recognize Gary Schatz for he used to be there in the Austin Transportation Department, like as he said, pushing the rope to try to get some of these kind of things through. But Gary asked about roundabouts. You didn't mention any roundabouts, so
I wasn't reading the chat. I wasn't reading the chat, but as soon as you said Gary's name, I was like, I bet he's asking about roundabouts.
Now, he wouldn't do that.
Yes, I actually had, I think, as one of the later slides, I thought I was getting a little too lengthy on time, but there are now various size roundabouts and traffic circles included as figures in the TCM. So they are, essentially adopted and cleared through the interdepartmental review. So should be a bit simpler to use one of these. Was there a more specific question, or just whether they were addressed?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Gary wants to weigh in, but that's I think it's great seeing the different levels of design. I guess I'm curious, when is a traffic circle used versus a roundabout? And is the difference is really the diverter things on the edges of the circle, or what's the distinction there?
The way that the distinction is worded in the TCM is that it's more like how I was walking through the differentiation of like a level 1 versus everything else. A traffic circle would be more like a level 1 treatment, where you're expecting it to be much smaller in size and reduce speeds more, and it's kind of like a shared space type of situation, versus roundabout is more I wouldn't say high design speed, because you're still wanting these, we're showing raised crossings and deflection to slow people as they enter the roundabout, but certainly a bit higher speed than a smaller traffic circle. You also wouldn't necessarily design a traffic circle for emergency vehicles to go around. I don't know if Hayden is on the call, but she certainly knows that in the Blackland neighborhood here in Austin, they struggled for a long time to get traffic circles put in their neighborhood because of emergency service requirements to go with the flow of traffic. So we have addressed that now in the TCM, where they can, with lights on, they can go in this, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but they can go in the contraflow direction to get where they need to go, which lets us do much more kind of compact urban design.
Great, you answered my question before I could even ask it. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry.
The one thing I would offer is you mentioned you have in your figure there ICD, which is your inscribed circular diameter, kind of the quote size of your roundabout. We have implemented very successfully mini roundabouts, which means everything is mountable, kind of like what you've shown in your picture there, with an ICD of 25 feet. We got it into a T intersection, and it's not a circle, but it can be done. And we are okay with vehicles running over the center. We've also been able to implement what's called compact roundabouts with an ICD of about 85 feet. And a Cat Metro bus could literally do a 360 and not run over anything. So get your geometry right, and you can get them in a lot of places that you wouldn't think otherwise.
Yeah, I think we're about to install one down in Dove Springs at Terry and Pleasant Valley that I believe is also 85. Yeah, just about as very similar. It's on a frequent bus route as well. So yeah, we're all about the compact roundabouts.
And if you can do I-35 and 51st, man, you can do anywhere. Come on.
Okay, well, great. Unless there's another burning question, maybe we should move on. Then another whole part of the transportation criteria manual is that I asked Dan to try to explain to us some about how this is going to impact development in Austin. And so with that, hand it to Dan Hennessy, also in the Austin Transportation Department.
Thanks, Jay. And I'll try to be brief so that Austin doesn't take up the whole time here. But what we intended with the Transportation Criteria Manual is essentially a development review process that would complement and enact the policies established in the 2019 Strategic Mobility Plan and get away from a very private vehicle-centric analysis and results model and get to something that more supports the very multimodal policies of the 2019 plan. Previously, the analysis was very vehicle focused, and the way that the administrative rules were written was that most of the analysis focused on cars, even things like adding crosswalks or sidewalks, bike lanes in certain cases were assessed as penalties to vehicle travel time, and that's how they were viewed, rather than as part of our bikes and sidewalks and urban trails master plans, or as part of our overall transportation strategies. We also were very focused on the process of TIAs and being able to defend ourselves to neighborhoods or to city council members or as part of zoning hearings, rather than better understanding the bigger picture with related to our plans for transportation infrastructure. And I think this changes that quite a bit too. Really, these assessments now are going to be more holistic in terms of the areas that the developments are in, rather than just the immediate surroundings. And a big part of that is the street impact fee that the city council approved at the end of 2020, and will begin being collected next summer in 2022. Those fees are essentially a rate-based fee based on the land use and density of that use or those uses on a site, and are predictable from day one of when a developer or an applicant has an idea for a future site plan or building permit. They would understand what their transportation fees are. If the project is anticipated to be large enough that it might affect some other facilities, then we would ask for some assessments of specific improvements that might be required. But essentially, those would count as offsets to those fees in most cases. And the real reason for this is that through all the work done in the Strategic Mobility Plan and the Transportation Criteria Manual, we've identified for almost every street where we want additional roadway capacity, whether that's wire lanes or more lanes or new roadways. We've identified where we don't very specifically want any more roadway capacity, particularly at certain intersections. And we have also made major strides in developing the standards for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure through the city. And so that's really the basis for this program. We're also moving away from a lot of the controversy surrounding development assessment happens during time of zoning right now, right? And so what this proposes to do is wait until site plans are ready to do that assessment. And the street impact fee really gives us the ability to do that, knowing that we have the stick available to us down the road rather than needing to agree as part of any zoning ordinance. We will be very clear and transparent about what the anticipated street impact fees will be, what potential improvements are, what the identified improvements are, so that everybody has an understanding of what's coming to that area and what those fees might be able to fund, rather than the previous ad hoc basis of every site plan, every zoning case was a negotiation that guaranteed no infrastructure improvements, to be frank. The way that the code and the administrative guidelines were written were soft enough in certain cases that the development community was able to not participate in transportation improvements, and so that will have gone away. We're also focused a lot on transportation demand management strategies and really encouraging developers to decrease their street impact fee payments by making their projects less dependent on private vehicle trips to and from their projects. So there are a lot of infrastructure strategies, including improved bicycle parking facilities, shower facility and locker room facilities, kind of the softer things around the edges that might make multimodal transportation more appealing directly to the site. There's also some improvements related to adjacent transit stops and pedestrian connections to and from other multimodal hubs in the area. And then the biggest one, I think, is the incentivizing providing less parking for each development and really making the development community assess their parking for a site and not just build the only assessment not just being the minimums that are currently provided in the land development code. Again, we're thinking about this as both as a carrot as opposed to a stick in terms of, we can't really do anything about the code until the code gets updated with respect to parking, but we can provide incentives for people to provide less parking as it relates to their development and hopefully to encourage more multimodal trips or just discourage private automobile trips that don't have to be there otherwise. So that's really where our mindset is and where we're taking this transportation criteria manual. I think the reception so far has been generally positive about the steps and the direction. A lot of questions about the actual administration and how this will work because it's a fairly different tact from the way that things have been done for decades here. But we're looking forward to working through that with the development community and their consultants as those site plan applications and building permit applications come in. So I know that was brief, but I did want to make sure we had time for folks from other cities too.
All right, thanks so much, Dan. And to some extent, that chart that you have is kind of the whole story. So, well, so I think also this part of it is very exciting and sort of streamlining this process. And there's really kind of there's a lot there. And I guess I wonder. My question, and see if anybody else has any questions. Please raise your hand. What is it for somebody who's skeptical of development? The changes are going to mean that basically, like, the benefits are going to be better. Basically, that the local, what happens when a building comes into your neighborhood is going to be you're going to have better sidewalks. Basically, is that what do you think about that?
Yeah, the specifics. I would hesitate to commit to the specifics, but what I would say is that the transportation department can now guarantee that a development applicant will contribute to transportation improvements. Whereas before we had to go through a very time-consuming process of negotiation, identifying the improvements. Are the improvements feasible? Are they within the control of the developer? How much can we actually charge them based on our guidelines? Do we have enough funding to complement that fee so that we can actually get it built. That all goes away. We've now identified the improvements through the street impact fee program. There will be some related to the specific site plans themselves, but that's all within the administrative code. And so now everybody knows on day one where we're starting at, and then we can whittle down from there if there are specific improvements that are needed for construction. But otherwise, that money will come at the time. To get a building permit, the developer will have to pay that fee. And then the transportation department, through community input and council member engagement, will determine how to use those funds on the projects that are included.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And if it doesn't seem there's any questions jumping up, we will move right along. Next, we're going to move to the west side of Texas and hear from Joaquin Rodriguez on what the city of El Paso has been doing in general, changing street design, and specifically things like the NACTO urban bikeway design guidelines. So with that, there you go. Thanks, Joaquin.
Cool, thanks. Thanks everyone for having me. It's great, to be from El Paso and get included in some of this stuff. Our big goal, El Paso is kind of in the middle of a sort of planning renaissance. We adopted our comprehensive plan about a decade ago and have had a lot of false starts and struggles in implementing a lot of that stuff. So recently, in the past couple of years, we've sort of revived the long-range planning functions. And through that, namely, it was the development of the East Side Master Plan that started to kickstart some of these initiatives. In that development, we identified a need for some updated street design standards. And essentially what we're trying to do, right, is tie street design standards to our future land use map designation. Namely, we're recognizing that our previous approach of, the sort of one size fits all cross sections in our design standards document wasn't really working. Additionally, we have street design requirements across 4 or 5 titles of our municipal code. We have internal project cross sections for our public works projects. We have a different set of standards in the bike plan, and then we have the design standards for construction. So it's kind of a mess of different areas where a project manager or a designer would have to go to figure out what the street for this area needs to look like. So again, our goal was to eliminate a lot of those redundancies and inconsistencies. One of the main goals was to implement our bike plan in a more meaningful way. We are focusing on reducing required travel lane widths. And additionally, we're trying to provide more administrative flexibility for existing conditions. So this is the City of El Paso's major thoroughfare plan. Was most recently updated, I think, in 2013, after the adoption of our comprehensive plan. The old MTP, the one that's currently in effect, is sort of the standard hierarchy of transportation facilities, right? There's local streets, collectors, minors, and majors, and that's it. Our design standards for construction tied cross sections to those classifications, but really it was just a one size fits all approach. This is what the road looked like. This is what it needed to be designed as based on the MTP designation. So what we're proposing is to revise the MTP to recognize context in addition to that functional classification. So we would have rural, drivable, suburban, and compact urban context zones within the MTP. And this is, sort of a visualization of that here in El Paso. On the left side is a compact urban cross section. On the right side is more of a drivable suburban cross section. Both of these currently are classified as major arterials and would be subject to the same design standards. So again, we've sort of taken this kit of parts approach to context-based cross-section design. So it's probably hard to see on your screens, but if you look over at the left, we have the context zones and their associated future land use map designations. and then sort of some guidance to develop a base cross section that is reflective of those factors. Again, this is another sort of description of, or sort of visualization of what that looks like. So these are both local cross sections, but you can see a compact urban cross section where we've included parking on either side of the streets, depending on the commercial context of the area, and then a more suburban area type where parking may not be a priority. We can then, work to minimize that cross section width and enhance other facilities along that thoroughfare. Again, Jay mentioned this earlier, but we, in I believe it was 2010 or 2012, we adopted the city's bike plan. It was adopted by resolution, and there was never really any meaningful effort to codify those requirements. So if you were to look at our subdivision development code right now, essentially there's one paragraph relevant to bicycle facilities that would require a 10-foot hike and bike on either one side of the road or both sides of the road. There's no guidance for any expanded bicycle facilities, no on-road facilities. It was just a one-size-fits-all approach. So what we've done is implemented our bike plan and really just adopted the NACDO standards. So the city of El Paso adopted NACDO about a decade ago as well, but we did so only for city projects, public works projects. What this effort does is extend those design standards to private development as well. And it allows us to use the city's proposed bicycle network facility diagrams to identify what sort of facility is more appropriate for what type of thoroughfare, and then implement a bicycle facility design that's appropriate. Again, this is just a more detailed look at what that kit of parts approach looks like. And the reason we went with this kit of parts approach, I'm sure you all are familiar that a lot of times when a new development or a proposed development goes in front of the City Plan Commission, it's sort of, here's the standard. Can they do the standard? If they say they can't, they can ask for a waiver, right? So it's really all or nothing. So the hope is with this kit of parts approach, we can start to have more of a negotiation in that. In that we can have more of a back and forth. I'm sorry, I don't know if you all have seen it, but my Teams is blowing up right now on the screen. But hopefully we can have more of a back and forth and start to implement some facilities rather than just a wholesale exception to those improvements. And kind of to what the previous speaker said, this is sort of our first step. We are also looking at a fee in lieu of improvements policy that we hope to implement in the near future. And that's pretty much it. The rest of the slides aren't super important. Again, our street design manual is also up for public comment right now. I can drop this link in the chat. It's actually a much earlier draft before we decided to add in the bicycle facilities piece. But you get an idea of the direction that we're trying to head in.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's exciting to see what y'all are doing there. And I guess one interesting part I'll just throw in as part of the city of El Paso city plan was that sort of context sensitive approach to kind of everything. And I don't know if people know about that, but that there was sort of a urban zone, and that's sort of built into the whole approach to land use and transportation for the city of El Paso. And so it's neat to see all that coming together in the street design guide.
Yeah, it's been really a big missing piece for us. The problem with the one size fits all approach is that you end up with the same streets everywhere. So all of our new developments look identical to other new developments at this point. There's no sensitivity to context. There's no sensitivity to surrounding development. So hopefully we can start to get some streets that make sense for their surrounding development and spur some new development that takes advantage of that.
I guess we have a comment, which is sort of a question, and please raise your hand or jump in if you want to send other questions. But Adam suggesting it would be great to see shared streets and car-free street categories in all Texas City street design guides. So I just wonder if you guys talked about sort of shared streets or car-free streets, and what do you think about that?
So as part of our street design manual with the NACDO standards, we are adopting the bicycle boulevard design standards. So anywhere that the bike plan identifies as being appropriate for a bicycle boulevard, that's what the required cross section would be for any public works improvement project or private development project. So we don't have a Wooner cross section on there quite yet, but I think bicycle boulevard is about as close as we'll get in the meantime. Another big thing that we're trying to convince our local policymakers of is that there's no reason to wait 20 years to update this manual again, right? We need to treat these as living documents, and as the city grows and evolves, and as our understanding of transportation grows and evolves, we should be willing and ready to adapt to that by amending these codes and amending these design manuals.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I was just trying to look up on the map, and maybe Scott could jump in. I got Scott White took me on a B-cycle tour of El Paso recently. And there was one particular street that I was amazed by. There's a shopping street where you guys have done bulb outs, and it becomes a lovely street to bike and walk. And I don't know if Scott, if you're hearing me, do you know what street I'm talking about that we rode down?
Was it South El Paso Street?
Maybe so. And it's sort of just outside of downtown, and there's all kinds of sort of street shopping and like little retail stores all along the street.
Yeah, that was South El Paso.
Yeah, so South El Paso was part of this Sun City Lights initiative that the city's been working towards for a while, and it's really a placemaking initiative to start creating walkable streets that people want to go and spend time on. And it's not only creates a safer pedestrian environment, but the hope is that there's some economic development realities there too. Yeah,
and that's a really neat example. It's basically, the street design is a lot like sort of what Austin was talking about for neighborhood bike boulevard kind of streets, but that's actually a pretty dense street with like it's a active urban place. So it's very cool. Well, do we have I guess, Scott, one more question, then we'll move on. How might this apply to retrofits in existing streets?
So Scott, this will actually codify these design requirements for retrofits in existing streets also. So we'll have to make an effort as the Capital Improvements Department to implement these design standards as well in our projects. There's always going to be that element of feasibility and engineering judgment. But now that these are codified, at least this sets the baseline of what we should be aiming for.
Okay.
Okay. You can text me your question later if you want.
Oh, did somebody else have a hand up? Or
I think Cito Negron had his hand up, but he's got my phone number. He can text me.
Okay. Well, Cito, you want to jump in real quick?
Well, this might be an El Paso specific observation, but that place you were on, South El Paso Street, it does look nice, but it costs a lot of money to put all those lights up there, and it was very thriving street traffic. In fact, it probably had as much street traffic as say 6th Street at nighttime, right? It was right across the bridge. And so there's some macro factors in terms of the bridge closures and the increased pressure on the border that makes it harder for people to come over. But at the same time, the city is putting a ton of money into that. And not to put Joaquin on the spot, and I don't know what the exact end goal is, but the point is that was a very thriving, walkable urban space already. And the city's investment there is more of a gentrification kind of investment than it is, kind of retrofitting it for the benefit of the folks that were there as already existing there. Although there may be some safety implications to what they did, but the bulk of the expense wasn't in the safety stuff. I don't think the bulk of the expense was like very expensive lights that cover the streets and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I was talking about the street design, and it just seems a very safe space for all the people shopping and walking there, and I'm not vouching for the lights, I guess.
Yeah, I think ultimately when we undertake these projects, that those two components kind of go hand in hand, right? The street design and the placemaking components. I won't really speak to the gentrification part, Tito. I think we probably disagree on that. I think there's always room for improvement along some of our high priority corridors and high value commercial corridors as well. But I think the main goal was to enhance that placemaking. You're absolutely right. South El Paso is an incredibly vibrant corridor prior to that project. We haven't really seen the changes that those improvements have made because of the onset of COVID shortly after their installation. But I think, if the goal is to show all of El Paso what we have to offer, I think that's, I think this project was successful in that so far.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's move all the way to almost the other side of the state, to the city of Houston. And let's start with Ian Hlavacek with the Houston Public Works to talk about some of how they've been changing their transportation design manual.
Thank you, Jay. That was a good attempt. We don't use the though. We just Houston Public Works, because there is only one the Houston Public Works, and that's us. But thank you, everybody. Good to be here. I am a managing engineer with Houston Public Works. I am in our multimodal safety and design branch. We have recently been renamed that. We renamed ourselves that to emphasize more of multimodal transportation. We used to be called traffic operations. So you can see how far we have come. And I will, I'll touch on a lot of the similar things that we've heard these our other partner Texas cities talk about. It's very nice to hear that we all seem to be moving in very similar directions in terms of our street designs and land use thoughts. But I want to focus a little bit on our very dry manual, the infrastructure design manual. And I bring this up because in Houston, this is the place where we put everything. It's a massive document, and this is how streets get built. It's how our drainage is built. It's how street lights are designed, traffic signals are designed, and we throw it all into one place. And we've got a lot of chapters. It's rather bloated. We talk about water, wastewater. The main chapters I work with are chapter 10, the street paving design requirements, traffic signal design requirement, traffic and signal design requirements, and then our more recent pedestrian transit and pedestrian design requirements. And you can see the page numbers on these are pretty wild. I know some other cities deal with different kind of design guides for specific topics, and we just throw it all into one. And so I'll talk about in terms of some recent changes we've made to chapter 10, and then next year we're going to be looking at chapter 15 and 17, which are more traffic related. Chapter 10 is our street design chapter. And I threw this in here because we've had recently a lot of streets that we redesigned, and some of them, such on the left, where we had major transit investments come in, and then also resulting in some brand new sidewalks that are not great sidewalks. And on the other hand, we have other streets that are absolutely beautiful. And so this is the manual that really helps to decide which kinds of streets are we building.
Hey, Ian, are you intending to be sharing something?
Is it not sharing?
Seeing it. It's
what
not sharing.
Oh, you've missed. Yeah, okay.
The whole thing. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Let's try this.
Aha, that seems to, yes, much better. Thank you.
You see the infrastructure design manual? All right.
Yes.
Yeah, I was talking about that stuff. All our chapters. Yeah. Good. Yeah, okay. This makes more sense now. Brand new sidewalks, good sidewalks, bad sidewalks. And one of the main things that we really changed recently that I wanted to emphasize is that we talked a little bit about lane widths. And just a couple of years ago, we were 12-foot lanes everywhere. And around town, that's still a lot of what you see, a lot of streets that are designed like highways. But now we are looking much more at 10-foot lanes. And the way we kind of handle this is a little interesting. We have our Loop 610, which is our freeway network. In Houston, we define everything in reference to our freeways. And for various reasons, we have decided within 610, our standard lane width is now 10 feet. Outside 610, it's a little more variable. Having to do with the kind of development that we see, that this is evolving though, and the fact that we're even talking about 10-foot lanes now is a big step for Houston. And what that gets us is just every foot you can get you space for extra trees, landscaping, bike facilities. I don't need to convince anybody here, I don't think, about what we can get from narrower lanes. But it takes some work to convince people from outside of this sphere about why some of these changes make sense. Including, this recently we've been talking a lot with our transit agency, and I think this is something everybody, the push and pull of a lot of these safety measurements go hand in hand with working with other agencies. So transit agencies typically will push for wider lanes, and we'll try to push back a little bit. I was thinking about not including this because I don't really have anything to say here, but I did want to emphasize, and I think I made the right decision now with Gary here, that we've had roundabouts in the IDM for a while, and they've been encouraged in Houston, but not very loudly. And a lot of people didn't know that Public Works supports roundabouts. And so we have fleshed out that section to go into a lot more detail, really more than anything, just to encourage people to look for those opportunities for where can you fit these, or if you can do them smaller, hey, we're open to mini roundabouts as well. A big change that we just did within chapter 10 to get to a lot of these are just very kind of in the weeds kind of measurements, right, and kind of design elements, but these are really kind of what make the street. And for a lot of people, these are not particularly interesting, but these really make a difference. So we have this idea of a design vehicle and a control vehicle, and for the longest time, the typical way of thinking about it is a design vehicle for a roadway. And so you want the idea being the vehicles that are using the roadways, you want to make it so the road can accommodate them, so large trucks can make turns without clipping corners and damaging curb. And that could even be, it could be a safety thing, that you don't want a big truck running over the sidewalk and hitting somebody on the sidewalk. So some of this is not just the evil traffic engineers, but there was a lack of nuance previously. And so we've introduced now that not every vehicle has to stay in the lane, in a designated lane for the whole time. That's okay. On some streets from certain movements, you can have large trucks swing wide. That's really what they're doing anyway, and it's not a problem. So we've codified that now to really encourage people to think more about, you don't have to design every little element specifically for a truck to make the turn. If you can think more holistically about how the roadways and intersections work and use them as a control vehicle. And along that line, we've opened up what the different kind of design vehicles and control vehicles are. So all of these really plug into how wide our lanes are acceptable, what are the curb radii at intersections, how are median openings designed. They impact a lot of the street features. So getting these design and control vehicles right is an important thing to do. And so we've introduced this idea of, we've widened it out. So now we're looking at the DL23 design vehicle, which are kind of smaller box truck. It's a NACTO truck standard. We've moved away from some of the really, really big trucks because we don't really see those on city streets. All these are different templates of vehicles if you don't look at these numbers all the time. And so we'll have buses, we'll have the WB, our big semi trucks. And only rarely now are we looking at the biggest trucks, because we really just don't see them on city streets. But previously, in previous iterations, we designed every street, or many of the streets and intersections for the absolute biggest vehicles that we could find. Still focusing on the curb radii, because this was a pretty big win for us. And this is going to take some time for all of these to propagate throughout Houston, so you actually feel these benefits. But it's the kind of thing that'll impact the streets in subtle ways in terms of speeds that people are turning, crossing distances for pedestrians. And so now we've also codified the idea of effective radii at intersections, where you might have other roadway features that allow vehicles to make wider turns. You don't have to make the corners such that you have to accommodate them. They can swing wider. If there's an unused bike lane, or if there's parking, or we don't have a bulb out, you might be able to use all of those elements to effectively accommodate the truck without actually narrowing the curve around the corner. And why that matters is for, I think everybody here knows, but these are kind of figures that we talk through to everybody to explain to them why our roadways might be looking different. So wherever we can shorten the distance that people have to cross, you'll do that. You can see where they would have previously had to cross with old design standards and wide radii at corners. Now people who are walking have to cross a much shorter distance. That helps also build out the ramps at corners. So where a lot of the times we'll have non-directional curb ramps for people, for all roadway users, just because the radii are so wide. Now with shorter radii, with smaller radii, you can actually do nicer, more directional curb ramps. All this impacts signal timing too, so there's some benefit to all the driving public too, because the less amount of time that you have to time the signal for a pedestrian crossing the street, you can actually give that time back to moving the vehicles. So there's actually a capacity benefit to doing some of these things. And then it can also decrease the speeds that people are turning and make the pedestrians more visible. And so that gets you everybody moving across the intersection as safely as possible. And I just got a couple of more things I want to touch on here. I'm also joined by David Fields, who will also talk about a lot of our pedestrian elements and some of the ordinances that have passed recently. But we have tied a lot of our city ordinance that deals with sidewalks into our infrastructure design manual, and we've tried to really clarify and link those up. So you'll see ideas now where we are actually by ordinance requiring that we define sidewalks and the different buffers on the side of the sidewalks differently. And we're not just saying, hey, you're going to build a sidewalk next to the curb. Now we're saying you actually have to provide what we're calling the safety buffer between the sidewalk and the cars, provide that extra level of safety. And on the other side, we elected to call it the frontage buffer, basically the front of the properties on the back side of the sidewalk. So all these are defined and required by the IADM now. And what that should result in is that now we have a place to actually put all the stuff that always gets stuck in the middle of the sidewalk because we haven't previously provided that much space. So all this stuff that a lot of which are they're necessary. Street lights and utilities are necessary. Different kinds of benches and street trees are of course desirable, but if you don't have places to put them, you're not going to have them, or you'll have them right in the middle of the sidewalk. So our sidewalk standards we have really kind of exploded that as well. We've tried to make that much more context sensitive. The planning department has worked very diligently to define different corridors where sidewalk widths are defined. So the IDM now will come through and have minimum widths that are much wider than they previously were. We're still keeping it pretty relatively simple. It's not, we don't have all the different kinds of cross sections that we've seen some of the other cities put together, but at the very least, we have pushed those standards up from just a couple of years ago. Our sidewalks were 4 feet wide. We finally got them to 5 feet wide a couple of years ago. And now 5 foot is the smallest sidewalk you should ever see just on the smallest streets. Almost every other street will have will either be a major thoroughfare with 6 feet. You'll have a DOD street, which is a designation for transit-oriented development along high-frequency bus lines or transit or light rail. Then we have also separate walkable places streets that is a separate plan with its own different rules and regulations for how development can interact with the street. And then for the safety and frontage buffer, we have a minimum and optimals too. We kind of wrestle with this because if you just put the minimum, we found frequently that's what you get. So we want to always be pushing designers to think, minimum is by definition the floor. It's the minimum. You can always go more on some of these things. That's different from some of the standards like lane widths where we don't want you to go more. So we've tried to introduce some of our standards are minimums, you can go higher, some of them are more maximums, and you might want to look at lower. And one of the things that we've introduced, and this is actually covered by the ordinance, I'll show you the problem, and maybe this will make more sense. This is all over, particularly downtown, but frequently this can be a situation wherever you have an opaque surface along the sidewalk, and you can have somebody walking right alongside that, and then have a conflict with a car coming out of a driveway. This is just one example downtown, but there's many of them. So what we're requiring now, and this actually can push back onto the private land as well, open up around the driveway so that there's not that flat wall that as drivers are coming out of driveways, the pedestrian crosses by without seeing the vehicle. There should be a lot more visibility. And since this is in our code of ordinances, we can actually enforce the development standards as they come in on the private property as well. And just, I think this is my last slide. One of the things that I have been struggling with a bit is that our design standards in Houston are evolving, and they're getting better, but they're already pretty good. There's a lot of streets that you see designed don't look like we want them to look, not because the design standards aren't there. It's for a lot of other reasons. And one of the challenges that I've been struggling with within Houston Public Works is that there's a lot of different levels that these design standards have to be followed and respected and known. And so in Houston, I think this is probably all of our Texas cities, you've got a lot of different people working in the street, a lot of different people who are not necessarily a city or government, who have some stake in how the streets work. It can be, sometimes it is city projects where we'll have a major capital improvement project that tears up the street, or we have a more minor kind of intersection project. But we also work with our transit agencies that have certain rights to work in the street. We have the county who does work in the street. Other governments like TERS's, which use tax increments to fund improvements within districts. And then of course we have private developers who are one of our leading impactors on the streets in Houston. And then frequently we have simple property owners that have to get permits for driveways, for example, and they have to go through this whole process, and they ultimately have to follow these design standards. And what that comes next is that most of these people will work with consultants, and they'll say, here, we want this kind of thing to happen on a street, and then the consultants will do the design. And they've got the push from their client. And meanwhile, they're hopefully knowing what the design standards are. And so there's an education here to make sure that all these different players know what we want the streets to look like and what we need the streets to look like. And then finally, all those plans come to city reviewers, and we have to make sure the reviewers know what the standards are. And we also need to have political cover for the reviewers to know that enforcing the standards sometimes is a political process. You have to be able to hold strong because you have this push from the out coming in. You have the clients pushing on consultants that are pushing on city reviewers and to get their project how they want it. And at all levels, you need to know what the standards are. And because at the end of the day, you're going to get a street. And if you have your design standards in place, that's one thing, but they're only useful if they're understood and respected at every level. And there's a lot, and there's more to this. There's actually the contractors who do the work, and there's the city inspectors, and there's other permits involved. And you know, if any part of this breaks down, you don't get what's in the design standards. So the problem is not necessarily the design standards. And I think in Houston, probably the majority of the problems that we have are a breakdown in the communication and the enforcement, less so than the design standards. So that was my presentation, simplifying lots of different things. We have a lot more in the design manual. A lot of it's really dry. I have a link here that you can go and look at it. We have all of chapter 17 deals with bikeways. We're going to be opening that up in the 2022-2023 review cycle. We'll be looking at chapter 15, which is our traffic section. It deals with traffic impact analyses, signal design, and driveway design, as well as a lot of other things. Then chapter 17 is bikeway, transit, pedestrian. And so over this next year, we'll be looking at for people who want to be involved with this, who can help us make these standards as good as they can be. They're already decent, but there's always room for improvement. And if you do take a look through these and you have any questions, you can email us at safestreets@houstonTX.gov. We'd be happy to take any kind of comments and review help that we can get. And I'd be happy to answer any questions we have now.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we maybe should move right into David's presentation and then keep talking after that. We're supposed to just have 6 more minutes, but we'll keep everything open and keep talking. David Fields with City of Houston Planning and Development Department. Thank you.
Sure. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, so I spent the last 5 minutes paring down, anticipating this, so this is going to be very, very quick. There are three things I want to talk to everybody about. So Ian just did a great job talking all about our infrastructure design manual. That's literally what to go build. The other piece of this comes out of the City of Houston's development code, which is when somebody wants to develop, what do we say they need to go do, whether on site or adjacent to their site. As many of you know, Houston doesn't have traditional zoning, so this is kind of as close to that. Without going into the nuance, just imagine this is kind of a parody for zoning code. So about a year and a half ago, City adopted what's known as the Walkable Places and Transit-Oriented Development Ordinances, which came out of a real desire from many members of the community to recognize that for any of our multimodal visions to work, it has got to start with walkability. And we are a very, very big place. We're 670 square miles. So one size was not going to fit all to make this work. So how could we get the equivalent of our zoning code pushing development to be building what we really need, either when we do it or when the private sector does it? So we put forward these two ordinances and they work together. So the very first question we get from everybody is, why do you have two? You couldn't just do it all in one. And there were actually different reasons. The objective for both are the same, but we did need to take two different approaches, and we'll go through that. So first of all, both are intending to enhance, create pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use developments, walkable places, good public realm, all the wonderful planning things we talk about. But we needed to kind of convey a little bit more about what it would mean outside of our offices downtown, more about what it would mean to the people in the community. So we needed to really explain the benefits, and that was allowing property owners to build more developable area, as well as reducing parking requirements to free that up, benefiting the neighborhood by more pedestrian space and more neighborhood space, safer places, more walkable streetscapes. But also the thing that people forget is doing all of these together actually activate the space and make it actually a more interesting place, which generally leads to higher property values, which frequently gets our communities going. But they are different. So the walkable places ordinance, that is specifically, that could be anywhere in the city, but it has to come from a local request. Separate, but very similar to that, is our transit-oriented development ordinance, which is anywhere where we have high frequency transit service. Right now, that's our light rail lines and our bus rapid transit line, although we are looking at our high frequency bus network next. But that is saying we have already invested in our multimodal transportation system. The city should be able to reap the benefits back from that investment. So what does it mean for these two? Because they're very, very similar. So I'm not going to read every line here, but there are different levels of eligibility. The TOD one is tied to where we have transit. The walkable places, as I mentioned, was everywhere. The two sides allow different types of applications for who can move it forward. The walkable places is much more the community-driven side. The amount of streets that could be designated vary to as little as one street segment if the community is asking for it. And the planning standards that get assigned to these are similar, but vary a bit based on the amount of reduction in parking that we can offer. TOD streets actually you can eliminate it completely, as well as the pedestrian realm that we ask for in return if you're going to be designated one of these types of streets. So this is actually what it looks like on the map and why these are so different, why it was important to do them two different ways. This is that walkable places area, the ones that neighbors can actually say, we want it. So these three pilot areas have embraced it, and these are the places where walkable places is in effect today, although next step is to grow this as neighborhoods want it. At the same time, this is all the places for the TOD zone, which is all the places where we have high capacity transit, which is much more linear, but also much more across our city. We spent a lot of time trying to explain this in very simple to use language. It's not the easiest concept for the public. Some people get it immediately and some people really get lost. So we used very graphic material, very question answer type, what this would mean for you, what would this mean for my street, why should why should our neighborhood be doing it? So we have a lot of material available. And in my last 1 minute, since I've timed this right, I want to tee up something Ian and I are working on right now, which will be the IDM, but really comes out of our Vision Zero work, where the city of Houston is moving away from vehicle level of service and moving towards multimodal level of service. And if you think all this stuff that we just talked about is making a big difference, wait till we no longer prioritize cars and speed, but we start trading that off in our design manuals for multimodal access.
Awesome. Very excited to see where that goes. And thank you so much, David. And sorry about
that's okay,
having to pare it down. I think if everybody who would like to stay wants to finish this conversation, we should finish it up. I think it's kind of amazing to think about, say, 10 or 15 years ago and like how much progress is happening. And so I think just everybody kind of all around should be kind of proud of where just huge changes happening. So I think it's very exciting. There was a comment from Ann Zeta in Fort Worth about just, there's real pushback on roundabouts. And it's that people think that other people don't know how to use them or they're scared of them. And so it's an interesting conversation about, is there a driver education element of roundabouts in Texas? And I was thinking I would take that. I'd be curious what anybody thinks about that, but that wanted to make sure everyone knows that the Texas Strategic Highway Safety Plan is the state's kind of how the state wants to approach safety. And the process for starting a new 5-year cycle is booting up fairly soon. And so I'll put a link in the chat, but everyone here could be involved in that process. And this idea of like having ubiquitous adoption of no roundabouts are okay, you guys, really could be a strategic highway safety plan thing. And so, but any other thoughts on that?
I can give you my personal thoughts that I don't think education is ever a bad thing. And I think in this case, it could be good. I think a properly designed roundabout is more or less self-enforcing, especially if they're designed at the right size, they're not too big. There might be a certain element of, this is a really scary thing and I don't know what to do. So I'm going to be a very careful driver and not get in a crash here. I'm not too worried about it. I think there's a certain learning curve and people learn. But if you can, I think it's one of those things that it's maybe not as critical, but it can be beneficial at the same time.
Yeah.
I think the issue that I see over and over and over again is people going through them way too fast. And like, I just went through the brand new ones right next to downtown Fort Worth, and the signs that tell you which streets are exiting where are just completely wiped out because someone just plowed right through them. I think it's that education about the street is not designed in order for you to drive your car as fast as you possibly can. And this is the stuff that all of this material is trying to teach. And I'm just trying to figure out how to get that out to the general public, because they're not slowing down and they're still expecting the road to be forgiving.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a big part is educating designers on what a roundabout should look like. It's very easy to design a really bad, unsafe roundabout. If you all haven't seen them, just come to El Paso, drive around for a bit. Scott and I live in a neighborhood where there are some really poorly designed roundabouts that just prioritize through traffic, and there was never any design consideration given for the pedestrian element. So that's what we struggle with, I think, here in El Paso, and hopefully these efforts can help us educate designers and our own project managers on what a good roundabout looks like.
I have to echo that in that, we've got some out there that aren't the best, and people will tend to point to them as a reason why not. In my experience, I have found, in dealing with public and doing public, community surveys, etc., I find there's three factors that cause people to think negatively about roundabouts, and really a lot of this other innovative ideas, people-centric approaches we've been talking about. And it's human. It really doesn't have anything to do with the art or the science. It is bias, it is fear, and it is distrust. Bias because there's a lot of people who believe what we've always done is what we should always do, and that anything different invokes fear of the unknown, fear of the unfamiliar. But really the distrust factor, because I find when I do community surveys and I ask, first of all, how many people have experience with roundabouts, a large percentage of the respondents do. And then I ask, well, how many here think that they can successfully travel through a roundabout? Again, large number of respondents. Oh, yeah, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And then the next question is, to what degree do you think other drivers can? And it goes way down to no, they don't know anything. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to do it, etc. The point is, we are all the other driver to other drivers. We trust the other driver to do the right thing, and they do the right thing the vast majority of times. They don't rush out of side streets. They don't rush out of driveways. They don't, in a lot of instances, run red lights, but they do. But people aren't willing to trust. And I think when we have a community conversation where I have openly brought that up to say, let's talk about the emotions here. And then really you can get some folks to say, well, yeah, really, I'm worried about other people not doing it right. Okay, we can have that conversation.
I think a point I wanted to throw in here, just thinking about, the kind of changes we've talked about today are real, like compared to when I learned to drive in Houston in 1994 or something, very different, and like we've basically, our street design has trained all of us to be horrible drivers and to be aggressive, terrible people who try to kill people with their cars. And we're trying to change that. And it's really hard. And so my point being is that the political cover for all of this is a huge element. And that I think all of these cities have, we could all talk about elected officials who have let this happen or are letting these changes happen, even when people are really angry about it. And we have to get to the other side. And so I think, Councilmember Zeta, you've been through those ringers, but that it's a huge element is elected officials saying, the way we used to always say it in Houston is that we need to be asking our engineers different questions, and we need to stop asking them, how fast can you get me somewhere so much? And we need to first ask, how can you make sure no kids are dying? And so that we need that political level to really get to the other side of this. But it's going to remain hard, and people are going to be mad about it throughout, because we all were trained, we were all raised on the way it's been.
So one thing that helps is that I think most communities I talk with agree on the problem. Most people agree that the roads don't feel safe, and please come deal with the speeding problem in the neighborhood. And if we come in with a suggestion for improving that just straight with a suggestion, sometimes that's not the best way. That, hey, here's a roundabout idea, or we think that if we do a road diet here, we'll actually be able to make it safer. What has worked better for me is to really approach from, all right, let's hear your problems and your concerns, and let's talk through, okay, why these problems exist and what are things that could change, and then kind of work towards some of these design solutions. Like at the end of the day, I've been able to convince communities of a roundabout that I did not think it would work. I mean, I didn't think they would come on board with us. But once we talked about it, yeah, we're all on the same page. Y'all are concerned about your kids, and this is going to look different. I mean, the toolbox is going to look different, because if we do the exact same thing we've been doing, we're going to result in the same roads, and that's not going to change anything.
Yeah. Which the way you were saying that made me think of another point I wanted to make is for all this, for basically all the people of Texas or all the people of their cities to see these changes in their lives, we are talking about money, and we're talking about there being money to retrofit and fix the streets where people live now, as opposed to just putting money into expanding to new growth. And that's, that's both, metropolitan planning organizations and TxDOT decision-making systems need to be fixed. But also cities and counties can put some bonds to the voters, and there can be more money that can actually be used to make the streets safer for the people who live here today, and that kind of stuff. So I think that's to some extent, if you have the greatest design manual but you have zero budget, then who cares? And so that's a big part of it. Is how do we actually have more people see these changes in their lives as soon as possible? So, any last questions? But I'll just say I thank you guys, everyone, so much for being here and for doing this amazing work. I think these kind of changes are the things our grandchildren's lives, these kind of design changes hopefully will build a very different world for them. So thank you all for doing it. And thank you for sharing today. So maybe with that, we'll just end it. And thank you all for being here, and see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks all.
Yeah, thank you.